Today, Jos Verstappen is known as Max Verstappen's dad, but before he was that, he was an F1 driver in his own right. He would have a very impressive junior career, and by the age of 12, he was the Dutch junior karting champion. He would compete around Europe until 1991 when he moved to cars. He won the Formula Opel Lotus Championship, the EFDA Nations Cup representing the Netherlands, German Formula 3, and the Masters of Formula 3. By 1994, Jos Verstappen was one of the biggest up-and-coming stars in motorsport and had been approached by every F1 team on the grid apart from Ferrari and Williams to become a test driver for them. At one point it looked like he was going to join McLaren, but just before the contract was signed, Benetton swooped in and gave him a contract to become their test driver. Benetton's two drivers at the time were newly signed JJ Leto and Michael Schumacher, who was just entering his third full season of Formula 1 off the back of getting his second ever win towards the end of the previous season. Jos would be a test driver for the team, learning from both drivers before trying to enter into Formula 1 properly the next year. But plans changed. During a pre-season test, JJ Leto had a really bad crash and injured his neck and was now unable to race. Jos would get the call to now race alongside Schumacher in the opening race of the 1994 season. And that went well.
A huge incident occurred on lap 35. Verstappen and Irvin becoming involved. Bernard being forced off the track. Verstappen with a full 360-degree turn over the top of Martin Brundle in the McLaren. And Brundle lucky to escape with only a bruise after being bashed on the side of the head by a wheel from the Benetton of Verstappen. All four drivers emerged unscathed.
And his second outing would also end the same way, but not as dramatically. For the next race, Leto would return, but he would stall on the grid and get crashed into, which would re-injure his neck. He would still race in the next 3 races, but a mixture of his injury and disappointing results led to Benetton making the decision to put Jos back in the car.
Fortunately, both Lamy and Leto emerged unscathed from this big accident. Leto stationary, Lamy coming through from the rear of the grid, thinking that he'd spotted a gap, but Leto's car stuck there, stalled in its grid position, and Lamy slamming into the rear of the car. One wheel flying off the Lotus into the packed grandstands over the catch fencing and endangering the spectators in the seats there. The safety car out.
He would again spin out of the race on his return in the French Grand Prix. He would finally get his first race finish at the British Grand Prix, coming home in 8th, which at the time did not give you any points. The next race would be the German Grand Prix, where possibly the most famous part of Jos's F1 career happened. Refueling had been banned in Formula 1 for 10 years before 1994, and Benetton were about to give the world a reminder of how dangerous it could be.
Into the pits he comes. Very difficult as a driver, you know, to judge. We had a quick glimpse of it from Verstappen. Oh, and fuel. That's the first time we've had a fuel splash. Oh, my goodness me. Well, now, just let's keep calm. There are a lot of fire officials down there, and the fire is already out. And remember, when Gerhard Berger had his car burst into flames in Imola and he was sitting in the car unconscious, the fire marshals still got him out in plenty of time. And Verstappen should not have been in that car for more than a couple of seconds or so. They had medical air piped through to their helmets in case of a problem like this. And you can see the Benetton down there, and I cannot see Verstappen in it, so they've got him out safely. But that's the first time that the thing that everybody has feared since the reintroduction of refueling has happened, and with Verstappen out.
Jos managed to escape with only slight burns to his nose, but apart from that, no injuries. He would even return for the very next race and somehow managed to score his first ever podium alongside his teammate Michael Schumacher, who won the race. He would follow that up with another podium in Belgium, although he wouldn't actually celebrate on the podium for that one, as he got the podium after the race when Schumacher was disqualified. This would be the final podium of Jos's career. He would have 3 more races with Benetton, only finishing 1. In the final races of the season, Benetton were in a heated battle against Williams for the Constructors' Championship. Williams brought Nigel Mansell out of retirement to assist Damon Hill in a Williams dream team. So Benetton looked into their past drivers to bring someone out with equal stature, and all they could find was Johnny Herbert. So Verstappen was dropped for Herbert for the remainder of the 1994 season, and then Benetton decided to keep Herbert for 95, with Jos being loaned out to the team Simtech, who were an F1 team for 4 races in the season until they went bankrupt. He would later be let go by Benetton for 1996, but he would stay around F1 for the next 7 years, driving for teams like Footwork, Tyrrell, Stewart, Minardi and Arrows, who were also Footwork but under a different name, although this did not lead to much success. In the final 7 years of Jos's F1 career, he only scored 7 points. When reflecting on his F1 career later in his life, Jos would say that he lacked the emotional intelligence and political mind to succeed in Formula 1. He had the speed, but he was not ready when he got first called up. Mix this in with a bit of naivety from him and his manager when he signed his contract with Benetton. His contract stated that he would be a number 2 driver to Michael Schumacher, meaning not only did Michael get the preferential treatment, but altogether a better car. Many people talk now about how Red Bull have a car that is set up more for Max Verstappen than his teammates, and this was very similar, although it was not just the setup. Schumacher's car was overall better than the one that Jos had. The unfair Benetton contract that Jos was given would very much shape him for the future and make him want to have control over all aspects of his life from here on forward. Jos also said that Schumacher had a great political game and made sure that the entire team wanted to work for him. Despite this, Jos and Schumacher went on to be very good friends, and Jos would learn a lot from Michael that he would eventually pass on to Max. Speaking of Max, this is a video about Max Verstappen, so we might as well start talking about it. During his junior career, Jos would meet Sophie Kumpen, a fellow karter and an incredibly impressive one. She was even regularly mentioned as a name of a female talent who could eventually get into Formula 1. She and Jos got married in 1996, and her racing career came to an end in 1997 when she became pregnant with Max. Contrary to popular belief, Jos never forced Max into racing. Now, Max was always around racetracks growing up and definitely wanted to have a go, but Jos insisted that Max had to wait until he was 6 years old to try any form of racing. But after many tantrums and a call from Sophie, Jos allowed a 4-year-old Max Verstappen to try karting for the very first time. Max's first ever go in a kart was in the Genk track in Belgium in 2001. His natural talent was very evident from the start, but again, Jos never forced racing on Max. They did it because Max wanted to do it. Max would go on to do many karting races, and then around about when he was 8 years old, Jos sat down with him and said, look, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. And this is when their dreams of entering F1 and becoming F1 world champion began, and it's also when the Jos Verstappen tutoring would begin. There are a lot of stories about Jos's tutoring of Max, and I imagine it must have been a very difficult time in the life of Max Verstappen. As much as Max was doing what he loved, I imagine the non-compromising tactics of Jos and the collapse of his family must have taken a huge toll. There is a story about how after a bad race result, Jos made Max walk home to the hotel after the race. Someone picked him up halfway there and took him to the hotel, and when Jos found out, Jos took him back to where he'd been picked up and made him walk the rest of the way.
I remember he was probably 8 or 9 or something, and after Wednesdays after school, because school was finished at 12, we went to the go-kart track, and it was in the winter time, it was freezing, so I let the van run so he could warm up, and then we did 10 laps. Cold. I said, okay, go warm up. And then 3 minutes later, where is he now? I said, come on, drive. I'm still. I said, I don't care, drive. And
My
then
hands swelling.
he couldn't move his fingers, and I didn't care. I wanted to test things because I was building engines and chassis change and things like that. And I wanted to have the result because I was, I wanted to move forward.
Yeah.
But then he was,
barely hold the steering wheel.
I'm cold and things like that. And then when the fingers warm up, then again, and that's very painful. And I said, oh, shut up, you're all.
Trying to make me tough, I think.
And
But one of the funniest
yeah.
ones was, I think, in that final year in PFI, you remember?
Yeah. And
World Championship.
first session,
Yeah, I was driving like a potato, I swear. It was really
I
bad.
said, fuck, what is he doing? So I called him in. I was always on the tracks.
Yeah.
So he came back
knew
in
there was trouble.
So he would stand up and I really smashed him on his helmet here. Bang! And he was like,
All the mechanics around, they were like, what happened there?
and then and I said, what are you doing? He said, we're here, it's World Championship and I think we can win it.
If you don't drive normal, we go home. I pack up everything. My dad never said I was going to be a champion. He was always the opposite. He would tell me I was going to be a truck driver or like a bus driver. Really? Yeah, because he was always, in a good way, I think, putting the, like pressure, but making me realize that what I was doing at the time was not enough. I was winning my races and stuff, but he said it's not enough to be successful in Formula One, because it's not, you can't rely on your talent only to be the best. And I think slowly, of course, throughout my go-karting career, you start to understand that and start to work harder for it. And I think still, to my dad's liking, I think all the way to Formula One, I still didn't work hard enough in his eyes.
There was a race they went to once at an anti-clockwise track. Now, racing drivers train their necks to be very strong for most tracks which are clockwise. When it goes anti-clockwise, that takes a massive strain on a driver's neck, so they use padding to push the head up and keep it in position. Jos heard that Max was using these and called them pussy pads. And ever since that day, Max has refused to use them, even in Formula One, where everyone else uses them. Jos's desire to make sure Max didn't show any weakness whatsoever is a very old school mentality, even when that weakness isn't really a weakness. Also at this time, Jos and Sophie separated, and it wasn't the most amicable of separations, with Sophie getting a restraining order out on Jos Verstappen. Jos would also appear in court later over alleged assault of his now ex-wife. He was not found guilty of assault, but he was found guilty of threatening to assault her over text messages and of violating their restraining order. This would not be the first time Jos had been in trouble with the law, and it would not be the last. In 1998, he'd been found guilty of assaulting a man and fracturing his skull. This was after an incident at a karting track. And in 2012, he was arrested over alleged attempted murder of his girlfriend, with accusations that he drove his car into her, although these charges were dropped 2 weeks later. And then there is the most infamous story of Jos's treatment of Max, and that comes from the 2012 Karting World Cup.
It was a World Championship race, 2012. I mean, honestly, I think that was one of the easiest weekends of my career. Like, we were so fast, but I still managed to not win it. So basically, in a heat on a Friday or Saturday, I burned my clutch, so I retired. So I had to start 10th in the pre-final. Within a lap I was second already, and then I won the race with like 4 seconds ahead of number two. So then in the final, after the first lap, when I was in the lead, he got me on the straight because it was a very long straight, so it was a lot about slipstreaming. So he got me, and then I decided that I wanted to overtake him back straight away because I wanted to be in the lead. And it was a bit stupid and unnecessary. So I crashed, and no World Championship. So especially also because of my dad invested so much time already the years before preparing the engines, making sure that once I stepped up to that category that everything would be ready to go, So I was of course upset, but my dad was really, really upset and disappointed in me, of course. So he of course broke down like the tent, everything he threw in the van. I had to pick up the go-kart with a friend of mine on the track after the race because my dad said I had to do it myself. So we managed to do all of that, of course, my dad being very angry. So we then sat in the van, of course, on our way back home. But I wanted to talk to my dad about what happened, about my opinion about the incident. But my dad didn't want to talk to me, so I kept trying. And then at one point he said, like, get out, like here at the fuel. He stopped at the fuel station. He said, get out. I don't want to talk to you anymore.
But I picked him up. We drove, I think it was about 1,800 kilometers back home. I didn't say a word to him. And I think the whole week after, I didn't speak to him. And then we were sitting together. I explained him how I feel, and the whole week he didn't feel comfortable with the whole situation. But I really wanted him to feel the pain. It should hurt him.
Max would then make the move to Formula 3, and with his karting CV, he was an incredibly hot property, being approached by most teams, including Prema. Prema had won both the Constructors and Drivers' Championship for Formula 3 in the previous year, but with Jos wanting more control over Max's career, he didn't necessarily trust Prema due to their connection to the Ferrari Formula 1 team. Max would instead drive for Van Amersfoort Racing, who had previously finished 7th in the Constructors' Championship. Despite this, Max would go on to do incredibly well, including winning 6 races in a row at the midpoint of the season, and winning 10 races overall, both of which were records for European Formula 3. But ultimately it would be the decision to drive for Van Amersfoort that stopped Max from becoming Formula 3 champion. With a few DNFs due to reliability issues and even a did not start, Max would eventually finish 3rd in the Formula 3 championship, which would be the best result for any driver to drive for Van Amersfoort in European Formula 3. Van Amersfoort that year scored 539 points, and out of the 3 drivers they had in their team, 411 of those points came from Max. Now Max's talent had been seen on the world stage, and this is when Jos's idea of not signing him up to any young driver program came to fruition, as the world of Formula 1 now had their eyes on Max, including the 2 titans of the sport at the time, Mercedes and Red Bull. Red Bull had just come off the back of winning 4 straight world titles with Sebastian Vettel, and Mercedes had just won their first championship in 59 years with Lewis Hamilton, and both wanted the signature of a young Max Verstappen. Due to him not being affiliated with any team, Jos was able to play Mercedes and Red Bull off of each other, getting an offer and going to the other team and telling them what that offer was so they could one-up it. This would continue until Red Bull offered the Verstappens the only thing they knew Mercedes couldn't, and that was a Formula 1 seat for the 2015 season. Mercedes had Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg and had just won both world titles, so we're not going to drop either of them for a rookie, whereas Red Bull had their junior team, Toro Rosso. But with Jos haunted by his own career, he wanted to make sure that Max and him had even more control than ever. So they got it in a contract that Max would receive equal treatment and no teammate would receive any favouritism no matter who that teammate may be. They also made it so that Max would get multiple outings in practice sessions throughout the 2014 season. And finally, he had a clause in his contract that if Max was not in the main Red Bull team by the 2017 season, Max was free to go, which is a clause that no other Red Bull junior driver has ever had. And these kind of controlling contract clauses continue in Max Verstappen's contract to today. In his 2019 contract extension, he had a clause saying that if Red Bull weren't good enough by 2020, he was free to leave. There's currently rumours that there's a clause in his contract that if Helmut Marko leaves Red Bull, Max is free to leave. This idea of control over his career really comes from Jos's Formula 1 career. So Max would become the youngest Formula 1 driver of all time, debuting at 17 years and 166 days, a record which will never be broken, as the FIA have changed the minimum age of a driver to 18 years old after Max's debut. And despite Max being 5 years younger than his father when he made his debut, due to the tutoring that Jos had given him, he was far more emotionally intelligent and knew how to play that political game a lot better. Now, I'm not saying that how Jos treated Max is right, because I don't believe it was right, but due to that treatment, it did prepare Max in a far better way than he ever could before. And I do think that for 99% of people, if they were treated like that, it would destroy them. And Max was just that 1%, which meant he was able to be pushed by that treatment. Max was always going to be a great racing driver. Like I said before, even when he first got in the kart, the great talent was naturally there. But through the tutoring that Jos gave him, he went from great to perfect. And the one hope that I have is that a lot of fathers don't see the way Jos treated Max and use that as a guide on how to have a young child become a great racing driver, because like I said, for 99% of people, I don't think that would work and it would just crush them. But for Max, it worked. Incidentally, whilst I was making this video, I watched the film Whiplash, which is about a young aspiring jazz musician who wants to become the best in the world and his non-compromising tutor. And I feel there is a scene within that film that perfectly capitalizes the idea and mentality of this kind of tutoring that we saw from Jos Verstappen.
I told you that story about how Charlie Parker became Charlie Parker, right?
Joe Jones threw a symbol at his head.
Exactly. Parker's a young kid, pretty good on the sax, gets up to play at a cutting session, and he fucks it up. And Jones nearly decapitates him for it. And he's laughed off stage. Cries himself to sleep that night, but the next morning, what does he do? He practices. And he practices and he practices with one goal in mind, never to be laughed at again. And a year later, he goes back to the Reno, and he steps up on that stage and he plays the best motherfucking solo the world has ever heard. So imagine if Jones had just said, well, that's okay, Charlie. That was all right. Good job. And Charlie thinks to himself, well, shit, I did do a pretty good job. End of story. No bird. That to me is an absolute tragedy. There are no two words in the English language more harmful than good job.